Our first speaker I know well, Susan Meldrum. So Susan is currently a programme leader of the Post Graduate Diploma in Career Guidance and Development at Edinburgh Napier. She undertook a career guidance programme herself at Napier in the mid-90s. She doesn't look that old. And then gained nearly 20 years experience working in a variety of professional roles within the sector before returning to the university in 2014, which is when I first met her. Susan's research interests include developing group-based approaches to career guidance practice and applying critical pedagogy to teaching in higher education. Susan's paper is entitled "Enabling Students to Empower Other Learners Using Critical Pedagogy." That's fabulous. Susan, can I welcome you? And the stage is yours. You've got 30 minutes.
Thank you, Fiona. And I'm waiting on the slides before I start, so I think that's okay. Oh, here we go, that's great. Thank you very much. Right. Okay, so as Fiona mentioned, I'm Susan Meldrum and I'm the programme leader on the Career Guidance and Development programme here at Edinburgh Napier. And what I just want to talk to you about today is enabling students. So that's the students in the postgraduate diploma in career guidance and development to empower other learners using a critical pedagogy, and it's a group coaching model that I'm going to have a look at that I have developed. Okay, so can I have the next slide, please? Okay, and hit it again. That's it, great, okay. So this is what I'm going to talk about then. So I'm going to give you a bit of a context to the model itself and how I use the critical pedagogy. So talk a bit about that. Then I'll talk a bit about how I apply the critical pedagogy to the group coaching model that I'm going to talk about. Then I'll talk about the model itself before finishing by looking at a case study. So next slide, thanks. Great. Okay, so just to give you a very brief context to the where I'm coming from. So you know that I've mentioned before that I'm the programme leader and I've been at Edinburgh Napier for since 2014. Now, you might be wondering, well, what is this postgraduate diploma in career guidance and development? It's a programme that's been running successfully for around about 40 years or so. So it's a really well established programme at Edinburgh Napier. And it's a taught postgraduate programme. It's basically training professionals or students to be professional guidance practitioners. So going out and becoming careers advisors, career counsellors in the higher education sector, in the school sector, and college sector, or in the workplace. So the programme itself has, every year it has, it's once a year that it runs, and it has between about 20 and 25 students on the programme. So quite a small cohort. And as I mentioned, it's quite a practical course. A lot of it is, there's obviously the knowledge base that the students gain, but a lot of it is actually practice and skills to be a career guidance practitioner. So you can see how something like a coaching model, a group coaching model would be particularly relevant. Having said that, a lot of the practice to date in career guidance and development has been one-to-one practice. So in other words, teaching the students to work with one other person, or if you could see, look at almost like a counselling session, a one-on-one session. So most of the skills practice was based in that. But finding that with that approach, then it depends on the individual agency of that person if they are looking to take some of the, I suppose, the barriers that they face in entering the labour market, that they have to then go off and do it themselves. So what's been looked at in the sector is, well, rather than focusing so much on the one-to-one practices, why don't we develop group practices to a greater extent? And that's what I'm going to talk about now. Then the group practices have a much better chance of, I suppose, steering the career guidance practice towards the advancement of social justice, and also, I suppose, breaking that continuous cycle of inequality that arises from the one-to-one practice. So that's great. So, and the other thing I should just say before we move on to the next slide is that the model itself is explained in a lot more detail with the theoretical background, and there's some case studies in the article that was just mentioned a minute ago. So, group career coaching. I mentioned that the model is based on something called group career coaching, moving towards group career coaching rather than one-to-one. So the students, I should say, so I said that there was around about 20, 25 students every year that's on the top postgraduate programme. And in that programme, the students are starting to learn about group coaching. And the students practice the group coaching with the other career guidance students. So they do a lot of peer-to-peer coaching where they are actually delivering sessions. And they also get the opportunity to deliver sessions to other students in the university and other universities, and they also go out to school sometimes as well. So they gain practice at becoming proficient with the skills of the model itself. So the important thing to say about the model is that it does use counselling and coaching skills within the model. So things like using things like active listening, paraphrasing, summarising. So in other words, building up interpersonal relationships within the group. There's a facilitator, sometimes there's two facilitators, but it's very much encouraging all the learners within the group to be co-learners or co-facilitators. So other things, a couple of things to say about it, that in the group there's the group learn and develop and empower, which we'll go on and talk about in a bit more in detail in a minute or two. And the other important thing to say about it is that it's not just something that the students deliver and the other learners rock up to. It's something that has a bit of structure to it, it has a bit of learning content to it, and there's pre-planned learning outcomes and activities. So that it does have a bit of a structure to it. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so critical pedagogy. So next slide, we're going to talk about the critical pedagogy within the model. And he used to say that it's, so there's Freddie, it's, I suppose it's the group coaching model itself, to an extent, was something that had been developed over a number of years. And before what I considered bringing critical pedagogy into it, it was kind of stuck in loops of students when they were looking at, I suppose it's what thinking about it in terms of a career guidance context and who you would work with if you work in a career guidance context. So quite often the learners you've got are going to be looking for jobs. They're going to be looking for opportunities in the labour market. And so the learners themselves would be stuck in cycles of, okay, I'm facing barriers then, I'm facing barriers to maybe like lack of opportunities, maybe a lack of money, there's health concerns, there's lack of support networks, and it's, well, you fit into that then. Well, it's looking at, I suppose, If there's certain working conditions, then it's fitting into those working conditions, even if those working conditions are very poor. The learner or the person who's receiving the career guidance would be expected to fit in. But where the critical pedagogy is brought in is that it's kind of rejecting that the labour market opportunities are static and the job seekers should fit in. So the model brings in what Ferreira talks about, the awakening of the critical consciousness. So in other words, making the learners aware that they are looking at oppression, that they could be looking at being exploited or marginalised, or they might feel powerless, and being able to name what that is. So part of the model does bring in the awakening of the critical consciousness. And as I mentioned before, that it is a lot more powerful if you are working with someone and you've got other group members that are facing the same sort of oppression, and they're able to address that with the collective of the group, and they're more effective at it, empowering the change. Okay, so that's the critical pedagogy. So next slide, please. Okay, so the collective career coaching model itself then. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so the model itself then, there's a diagraphical representation of the model that I'll show you in a minute, and this is how it's broken down basically. So when I first started having a look at the how to come up with a career coaching model, I based on experiential, some of you might be aware of this, experiential learning and the COLE model. And it's in other words, like if you take part in a group activity, a discussion, you'll have the activity or the group discussion itself, then you'll observe and you reflect on what happened during that group discussion. Then you try to make sense of that. You try to sort of draw themes and meanings from it, and then you'll go out and you'll practice what you've learned and take it forward. So that was the model before I applied the critical pedagogy, but that kind of got a bit stuck in the, okay, there's barriers that you face, but how do you then go about changing things? So it was bringing in the critical consciousness of it, so having a discussion within the group, raising that critical consciousness. And I'll illustrate how that's done in the case study that we're going to have a look at in a minute or two. And then from there, what action could the group take? And then subsequently, how the group would then be empowered. So next slide, thanks. So that was how the learners learn. This is what the learners learn. So this is more related to developing your career and the career guidance part of it. So I'm not going to describe this in any detail. It's just making you aware that within the group coaching model, as it is a career guidance model, it's the kind of knowledge side of it. What kind of knowledge, what kind of skills do you need to build up in the sessions that you have? And this is what the learners would be covering within the different sessions. One of the things that's important about it is that, well, a couple of things, that the growth throughout life is basically being aware, being self-aware, and being aware of what your skills, what your strengths are, matching them up to availabilities within the job market, so what's out there and what jobs are out there, what opportunities are out there, being aware of the culture in different workplaces and so on, but taking it a stage further and encouraging those that are within the group to see the bigger picture of it. So the big picture is, and it kind of fits in nicely with the critical consciousness side of it. So making the learners aware and paying attention to the economy, politics, society, and how that fits in with the wider group. So that's what the learners would learn within the model. And next slide, thanks. So putting that all together into the model itself, then that's it in basically a diagrammatic representation of the model itself. So it's got the critical pedagogy and the wheel in the model, and it's got the code model and the boxes, and it's got what the learners would learn in the middle of the model. So next slide, thanks. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to illustrate the model itself using a case study. Next slide, thanks. So first of all, there is, just to make you aware that the journal article that is mentioned there, it has a couple of case studies which are based on research that was carried out. And one of the case studies was looking at a marginalised group of adults from a disadvantaged area in the southwest of Scotland who were looking at overcoming the marginalisation. So if you were interested in having a look at that, then do have a look at the journal article. So next slide, thanks. So for the case study we're going to look at today, to put it into context, it's basically a group of the career guidance students. So the career guidance students that I mentioned earlier that are doing the postgraduate diploma in career guidance and development, they worked with groups of widening access business management students in the third year of university. So those that are unfamiliar with what widening access means, so it's students basically from a disadvantaged background that maybe experience barriers to accessing higher education or barriers in the workplace. It could be related to maybe coming from a disadvantaged area, or maybe first generation in higher education, or maybe coming from a school that had a low number of students that enter higher education. So in the groups themselves, there would be 2 career guidance students that would act as the facilitators for the group, and we're up to about 6 or 7 business management students, and it's important to say that they were co-facilitators within the group. And as I mentioned earlier, the sessions were planned, they had learning outcomes and different activities within the group, but the structure itself is fairly fluid. So the business management students were all aware that they were signing up to the session, and they were interested basically in finding employment in the financial services sector. So they were wanting to find work in that sector, and felt a bit overwhelmed, a bit powerless about what kind of options they might be able to go into. Okay, so that's a bit of context to the case study. So next slide, thanks. Okay, so let's move this down. So there was 3 or 4 sessions for the learners that were participating in these sessions. So in the first session that was held, they looked at the vision basically. So the first part of the model. So basically working out what is it we want to get out of this? What is it we want to do? So the learners had an idea that, yeah, we want to get into a job in the financial services sector. So it's looking sort of basically like unpicking that and looking at what they mean by that. So that involved looking at things like, well, we really want to know what jobs are out there. What kind of jobs could we do? We know about things like an accountant, maybe an investment banker. There's jobs in insurance, pensions, there's a stockbroker, there's taxation. But why do we know what we want to do? Is it only financial services we want to go into? Do we want to broaden that out a lot more? Then unpicking it further with the help of the facilitator, they looked at, well, could we, and this was a lot of this is coming from their words, was thinking about, well, could we aim higher? Could we go for something that's a profession? Should we be looking at some entry-level jobs, or should we be looking at some of the professional jobs? Could we go beyond what we thought was possible? Should we just settle? Some of them talked about, could we do better than what our parents or family? And this was their words. So some of them felt bad about saying that, but recognising the parents, maybe words that were coming from the parents, they felt they could do better, they were wanting the children to do better. Getting out of rut was mentioned, being successful was mentioned, and talked about generally about wanting to get out of the comfort zone and wanting to take back some control over the future. So that was the session that looked at what they wanted to get out of the group coaching sessions. Next slide, please, thanks. Okay, so the activities then, that was basically looking at the activities in the developing career framework, which is, just to remind you, it's on the next slide. So I won't go into that, but there was various activities that were part of the group coaching that encouraged the learners to explore their career options and also be more self-aware, making them more aware of the big picture and so on and so forth. Next slide, thanks. And continuing with the activities, so it was important to have a look at, there was some barriers that the learners were facing. So I thought, that's great, that's ideal, I could go for some of those jobs, but in reality there's a certain number of barriers that we seem to be facing time and time again, and it was a frank, open discussion that the learners were having about the barriers that they faced. And I think that the being in the group encouraged that frank, open discussion, and the facilitator was able to probe as well. So things like, I'm not going to go through everything that's on this slide, but things like maybe lack of awareness of the workplace culture. Some of the learners had never experienced what working in a job in financial services would involve. Some of them had a lack of role models, so they didn't know anyone who worked in that sector at all, so they felt disadvantaged because they didn't know anyone who could maybe give them a head start. There was talk when it was starting to get unpicked a bit about, well, they're never really going to take someone like us, are they? So I think, well, what does that mean? What is he talking about? Someone like us? That there was a perception that some of the jobs were a bit posh, is what they were talking about, that maybe some of them felt they didn't talk the right way, that they felt that the people that are finding the work was perhaps they were all a bit posher, a bit more refined than they were. And they also talked about things like, well, I don't think their grades are good enough. I don't think the university courses are good enough. And talking about things like lack of money, lack of resources. And then a general feeling that people within the network, family, friends, they would say, oh, you don't want to do that. No, why you want to do that? Why set yourself up for that? Oops. Hi, someone trying to speak there. So there was a frank, open discussion about some of the barriers that they faced. So next slide, thanks. Okay, so in the steps phase. So in the steps phase, when we got to that, it would be looking at developing the critical consciousness. So there was a kind of sense with, oh, well, if you think you're not posh enough, or you think you've got the wrong voice, or you think that you won't fit into the culture, change yourself then to fit in with the culture. So I was kind of thinking, well, should that be the case? Should these learners have to do that? Or is there another way of doing it? So it's making the learners in the group aware of the wider structural, political and socio-economic influences on their particular situation. And there was a gradual awareness, well, wait a minute, we all do feel like we're in the same boat. We all do feel marginalised. This is not fair. This is not our fault. Should we just accept it? Should we just fit in? Or could we do something about it? How could we perhaps change the working cultures rather than us fitting in? Okay, thanks. Next slide, thanks. So at the transition stage, at the sort of final stages of it for this particular case study, it was looked at, well, what could we do about it? How could we empower ourselves? How could we move forward? So there was the group were coming up with a range of different options. And one of the things that was decided on was, well, what we can do is we can think about approaching companies within, so this is looking at companies within the Edinburgh area. There's a cluster of financial services companies within the Edinburgh area, and approaching some of the companies, planning to approach the companies to research what sort of diversity there is in recruitment practices. So do they take people from a widening participation background who have faced barriers getting into higher education, sort of coming from certain postcode areas, or schools that have a lower uptake of people going into higher education, and looking at, you know, is that because they're students, is there some sort of research that they could take forward with their learning going forward, rather than it being a mini research project? Could you develop it into something more formal? Within the university, there's a student futures placement team, part of the career service, and one of the barriers they felt going into financial services was that those from a more privileged background were able to call in the support network and were able to find a placement relatively easily. And if it was an unpaid placement over the summertime, then that's fine. They had enough financial resources to keep that going. But if you're from a widening participation background and perhaps don't have the network and also can't afford basically to do an unpaid summer placement, then how do you get round that? Is it a case for advocates being able to access some sort of paid placement? And also what the group looked at was setting up, it's not ending there, it's looking at it being cycles, continuous cycles, so not just ending after the group's finished. So looking at how can we keep this going? So setting up a task group with the widening participation team in the university and the placement team in the university to look at addressing the lack of diversity in financial services. If the recruitment practices within the companies are not taking people from a wide range of backgrounds, then is that something that you need to be speaking to the human resources teams about? So finishing off with this then, I suppose there's this drawn questions maybe at the end. Is it something, is this enough? Should the group have been looking at more? Could it have gone further? Is it a start? Could it develop over time? I've mentioned how it could develop over time, so looking at different task groups. There is an argument to say that it's by developing the group's level of critical consciousness that you could argue that it heightens the powerlessness. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so just to summarise, so we looked at the collective career coaching model, and it's being taught and also developed with students at Edinburgh Napier and on the Career Guidance and Development Programme. And over time, it's looking at developing it with other career guidance programmes in the United Kingdom. and it has the potential, as I've mentioned, to steer practice away from the individualised one-to-one model, which looks at personal growth and development outcomes, towards wider group empowerment and also social justice aims. There is a potential to teach similar approaches in other higher education programmes, for instance, like human resource management. And for that to work, then there's perhaps a need in higher education to support, to fund and develop approaches at the researcher, practitioner and the policy level. So thank you very much for that.